I really think that we've just been able to encapsulate the amount of difference in not only in my voice but in the kind of person I've become over these past 2.5 years.
He was 17, visibly nervous, and the audience had already begun to murmur before he sang a single note. Then he opened his mouth, and Simon Cowell fell silent. That voice, enormous and ancient sounding in a teenage boy, stopped the room cold. But the world that erupted in applause had no idea what Jonathan Antoine had carried just to reach that stage. The years of bullying, the isolation, and the self-doubt that nearly silenced him forever. Jonathan Antoine was born in 1994 in Essex, England, not into a musical dynasty, not into a family with industry connections or conservatory ambitions, just an ordinary household where a quiet, curious boy one day discovered something extraordinary inside himself. He was around 9 or 10 years old, by his own recollection, when he first encountered the operatic tenor tradition. Not through a teacher, not through a school program, through recordings. He heard Luciano Pavarotti, and something in him recognized it, the way a person recognizes a language they have never been taught, but somehow already understand. That world, vast, old, and full of a kind of beauty that most children his age had never even been introduced to, became his. Quietly, privately, almost secretly. Because outside of that world, life was harder. School was not a safe place for Jonathan Antoine. In multiple interviews given between 2012 and 2014, he spoke with remarkable honesty about what those years were like. The bullying was severe and sustained. He was targeted for his weight. He was targeted for his interests. And he was targeted for the kind of gentle, inward temperament that made him stand apart from the crowd in ways that, at that age, the crowd does not forgive easily. Music absorbed all of it. Every unkind word, every difficult day, every moment of loneliness that a boy that age should never have had to carry alone. He brought it to the music, and the music held it. Teachers noticed his vocal ability from time to time, but the encouragement was never consistent enough to make him believe it could be something real. For years, that voice lived almost entirely within four walls, practiced, deepened, and kept close because he had no certainty yet that the outside world deserved to hear it. What was waiting for him just a few years ahead was something neither he nor anyone around him had thought to imagine. It took a friend to change everything. Charlotte Giaconelli was 16 years old when she convinced Jonathan Antoine, then 17, to audition for Britain's Got Talent in 2012. By his own account, given in a 2013 interview with Classic FM, he did not want to go. Not because he lacked the voice, but because he had spent years being told, in ways both direct and quiet, that someone who looked like him and loved what he loved did not belong in front of an audience. The prospect of standing on a national television stage, in front of millions of viewers and a panel of judges that included Simon Cowell, filled him with something closer to dread than excitement. Charlotte saw something in him that he could not yet see in himself, and she kept pushing until he said yes. When the two of them walked out onto that stage, the audience had already formed an opinion. The murmuring was audible. The skepticism was visible. This is one of the uncomfortable truths about that audition. The reception before the first note was not warm. Jonathan Antoine stood there and absorbed it the way he had absorbed so much else throughout his life. Then he sang. They performed The Prayer, a piece that demands genuine vocal power and emotional restraint in equal measure, in front of Simon Cowell, Amanda Holden, David Walliams, and Alicia Dixon. Within seconds, the atmosphere in the room changed completely. Cowell, a man who had stopped hundreds of contestants mid-performance over the course of his career, did not say a word. He sat still and listened. The audience, which had been murmuring just moments before, rose to its feet. If you remember watching that audition for the first time, whether it was in 2012 or years later when someone sent you the clip, tell us in the comments what it felt like the moment you heard his voice. The clip that followed that broadcast became one of the most watched moments in Britain's Got Talent history. Across platforms, it accumulated over 100 million views in the years that followed, a number that continued climbing long after the show's season had ended and most contestants had faded from public memory. People did not just watch it once. They sent it to friends. They came back to it. Something in those few minutes held them in a way that most viral content simply does not. Charlotte had given Jonathan the courage to walk through the door. But it was his voice, that voice, built in private over years of quiet practice and carried through years of pain, that made the room stop breathing. They did not win. In the 2012 series of Britain's Got Talent, Jonathan Antoine and Charlotte Giaconelli finished as runners-up, beaten into second place by teenage singer Natalie Kerr. For many viewers who had watched that audition clip travel around the world, the result felt surprising. But in the music industry, the final placement on a talent show rarely determines what happens next. And what happened next, for Jonathan and Charlotte, moved quickly. Simon Cowell signed them to Psycho Records, his own label, home to some of the biggest names to emerge from the talent show pipeline. Their debut album arrived in November 2012, and it entered the UK albums chart at number 2. In its first weeks alone, it sold over 100,000 copies. For two teenagers who had been unknown 6 months earlier, those were numbers that even seasoned industry professionals would have found difficult to argue with. Classical crossover was having a genuine cultural moment in the UK at that time, and Jonathan and Charlotte were at the center of it, young, compelling, and carrying a story that the public had already emotionally invested in. The media coverage was significant. The concert appearances followed. On the surface, everything was moving in the right direction. But surfaces can be misleading. Beneath the shared success, something more complicated was quietly present. It was not conflict, exactly. It was more the tension that comes when two genuinely different artistic identities are packaged as a single act. Music industry observers writing at the time noted, with increasing frequency, that Jonathan's voice belonged in a different conversation entirely, that it was not simply good for a crossover act or impressive for a teenager, but was of an order of magnitude rarely heard in the UK market in years. The question of what Jonathan Antoine might sound like on his own, with repertoire chosen for his voice alone, with arrangements built around his particular depth and range, was one that critics were beginning to ask openly. And somewhere quietly so was he. By 2013, the duo was over. Jonathan and Charlotte parted ways professionally, a split that both handled with considerable public grace. There were no bitter interviews, no competing narratives, no industry drama played out in the press. It simply ended, quietly and mutually, the way some partnerships do when two people recognize that the road ahead leads in different directions. Charlotte would continue her own career, and Jonathan Antoine, at 18 years old, would begin the far more uncertain work of finding out what he was capable of alone. He signed with Sony Music Classical, a different world from the talent show pipeline, with different expectations and a different kind of listener. Work began on his debut solo album, and in 2014, when he was just 19 years old, that album arrived. It was called Tenore. Tenore debuted at number 4 on the UK classical charts. But the chart position was almost beside the point. What the album actually demonstrated was something critics had not fully anticipated, a musical range and interpretive depth that went well beyond what the crossover market typically produces. Reviewers noted, with some surprise, that Jonathan did not simply deliver a lyric. He inhabited it. There is a difference, and most listeners can feel it even if they cannot name it. At 19, he already understood that difference. The stories behind the voices that moved us, the ones that go deeper than the clip the world shared a million times, are exactly what this channel exists to tell. If that means something to you, subscribe and stay with us. The transformation during this period was not only musical. In a candid interview with The Guardian published in 2015, Jonathan spoke openly about significant weight loss, about learning to occupy his own body with more confidence, and about the slow, ongoing work of separating his sense of self from the viral moment that had defined him in the public eye since he was 17. That audition clip had introduced him to the world, but it had also frozen him in the minds of many at a single moment in time. Moving beyond it required more than releasing new music. It required a different relationship with his own identity. He was not chasing the next viral moment. He was not trying to recreate what the talent show had built. He was doing something quieter and more difficult, constructing a real artistic life, one careful decision at a time, on his own terms and at his own pace. At 19, that kind of clarity is rare. He had earned it the hard way. The cameras moved on. Jonathan Antoine did not. Between 2015 and 2022, he continued doing the work, steadily, seriously, and largely out of the public eye that had once tracked his every appearance. A second solo album followed Tenore, expanding his recorded catalog and his repertoire. Concert and touring work took him across the UK and into Europe, not the arena-scale spectacle of a pop career, but the kind of sustained, disciplined performance schedule that forms the actual foundation of a life in classical music. Night after night, city after city, with audiences who came not for the viral story, but for the voice itself. This is the part of an artist's journey that rarely gets documented. It does not generate headlines. It does not trend. But it is where the real work happens, and for Jonathan Antoine, it was where the real transformation took place. Most of us have carried something that the world around us didn't understand, a talent, a passion, a version of ourselves we protected because we weren't sure it was safe to show. Jonathan's story might remind you of a time you almost didn't show up for yourself. In a 2019 interview, he reflected on the gap between the frightened 17-year-old who had nearly refused to walk onto that Britain's Got Talent stage and the artist he had gradually become. Confidence, he said, had not arrived in a single moment. It had come through thousands of small decisions to keep practicing, to keep performing, to keep showing up even when the world was no longer watching with the same intensity it once had. Vocal coaches and collaborators who worked with him consistently during this period described someone of unusual musical seriousness. He was not coasting on natural ability. He was studying the tenor tradition, its history, its demands, its possibilities, with the kind of scholarly devotion that most young artists with a built-in audience never feel the need to develop. He treated his talent not as a shortcut, but as a responsibility. The story of Jonathan Antoine after the cameras left was, in many ways, more interesting than the story they had captured, and it was still being written. At 30 years old, Jonathan Antoine is not who the internet thinks he is. The internet knows a teenager. It knows a nervous boy in an ill-fitting jacket standing on a stage while an audience made up its mind before he opened his mouth. That version of him, frozen in a 3-minute clip that has now circulated for well over a decade, continues to find new viewers every year. People discover it for the first time and send it to someone they love. The view count keeps climbing long after most viral moments have collapsed into irrelevance. In that sense, the audition has taken on a life entirely independent of the man who performed it. But Jonathan Antoine, at 30, is something that clip cannot fully contain. He has spoken in recent interviews with a maturity and self-awareness that is not performed and not practiced. It is the quality that comes from someone who has genuinely examined his own story and made peace with its more difficult chapters. He understands what that stage in 2012 gave him. He also understands with equal clarity what it nearly cost him, the years of navigating an identity built in public before he had fully built one in private, the weight of a single moment that millions owned but only he had lived. The bully boy from Essex who almost said no to the audition has become something that could not have been predicted from that single clip alone. A working classical artist with a body of recorded work, a concert legacy that spans more than a decade, and a voice that, by the consistent account of those who have followed his development closely, has only grown richer and more commanding with age. The instrument that stunned a room at 17 has been deepened by 10 years of disciplined study, performance, and the kind of lived experience that no conservatory can teach. He is, at 30, exactly what that audition promised he might be. Not a moment, not a memory, not a footnote in a talent show's history. A musician, whole, serious, and still becoming. The best of what Jonathan Antoine has to give the world is, by every indication, still ahead of him. And that, more than anything, is worth celebrating. His is one of a handful of voices from that era that the world heard once and never quite forgot. The next story on this channel belongs to another voice just like that, and it begins in a place you would never expect.